Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Kurt Thompson.
And my friend, the most beautiful man in the world, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known
by the most beautiful man in the world. I just.
Listen, I'm going to bring back Dr. Desire. That's all I got to say. Because he's around.
Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness.
It's great to see you today, Kurt.
Man, it's good to see you. I understand so we're recording on March 10th? March 10th, 11th.
Yeah, 11th.
Yeah. 11th. And you got weather coming. It's getting close to spring, but winter's not giving it up.
It's crazy here because last Saturday, Nell and I took this amazing walk. It was, we're in t-shirts. It's 70 something degrees and beautiful. And then this Saturday, it's going to be 18 degrees and it's going to snow tonight. And then next week it's in the 70s again. So it's just this, this battle happens every year between winter and summer that is spring. And it's just it's a fight that happens.
And the front line of that pitched battle is Covington, Kentucky.
It is right there, there.
It's the Battle of the Bulge right there.
God's country.
Right on.
Yeah.
Right on. Well, and hey, just for our audience, like we know that also we're missing. We don't know if Amy's going to join us today at the end of our conversation.
She's joining us.
We're
not giving her the option.
I wonder because, she had foot surgery.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking and she said that she wasn't sure if she was going to be able to join us or not. And I'm like, what a pansy. No commitment.
None. And it's her foot.
Right, it's her foot. It's like my dad wisely would say, it's too far from your heart to kill you. And
I'll go even further. It's not her foot. It's her toe.
Wow, it's her toe.
A little, yeah. I just.
Yeah, and and I'm thinking look, she she had this surgery. So it's not it's surgery, but look, she was asleep the whole time.
Exactly.
How bad can it be? You're not even awake it's not like you suffer. You're asleep.
Right. I'd like to have a nap in the middle of the day.
I would too.
Right.
She came home. She said she was sleepy. When she came home, wow, I wish I could have that life. I can't afford to be sleepy. In the middle of the day.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, she's going to join us. If you are watching on YouTube, she will be here at the end of our recording here today and joining us.
Yeah.
Whether she likes it or not.
And that's right. And we can't get, as far as Amy's concerned, we can't get to the end of our recording soon enough.
Fast enough. Exactly.
Dang. And
so today,
go ahead. No, go ahead.
So today we are taking on trauma. Okay, first of all, we are in the middle of this season, this fourth season that is all-encompassing trauma. That we've been in this for a while, and today we are going into the specific subject of trauma and the church. And Kurt is titling this episode "Hospital-Acquired Infection: Trauma and the Church." You're going to have to explain that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, just again, for our listeners, I just want to acknowledge that this is a topic that's, that for many, it will be new territory. For many people haven't had an experience of trauma in the church. But many of you have had experiences within the church that have been really painful. And we want to acknowledge that up front and acknowledge that once again, as we talk about these things, it's possible that you could find yourself feeling things emerging that you're familiar with. But for some of you, you might find that things are emerging that you have, put away for, years, maybe even decades, that start to show back up. And we want our time to be a time in which we acknowledge when we're talking about trauma, because this is the world that we live in.
Yeah.
We're not trying to make it more or less than it is, but we want to acknowledge it for what it is, and also then encourage our listeners for you to seek help, for you to connect with people that you trust, whoever that might be. And we hope that this episode provides some, sheds some light and some freedom, because we don't just want to talk about what's bad. We also want to talk about what is the healing that Jesus comes to offer to us, not least of which in the very place that we sometimes would expect only good things to happen, that being in the church, and things quite the opposite sometimes do.
Yeah. And that's where, some real damage and trauma can happen.
Yeah.
A couple of resources that we're going to be utilizing today: Redeeming Power, a couple of books here: Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church by Diane Langberg, and When Narcissism Comes to Church by Chuck DeGroat.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, two really. I know these folks personally. They're just really deeply committed followers of Jesus. They're brilliant. They're articulate. They're funny. They're warm. They're caring, and both have practices in which the work that they do with the people that they care for is reflective of what you would read about in these books. And so I would highly recommend that you pick up a copy of one or both of these books, and allow yourselves to be nurtured and nourished in the pages that you read there. We've titled this Hospital-Acquired Infection because as I was thinking about this episode, I thought, like, oh my gosh, like what I'm sure there are equally effective or even better metaphors for this, but I want to talk about this because I think this really helps me make sense of what happens. And there is a thing in the medical field called HAIs, right? This hospital-acquired infections. And we begin, though, not by talking about the infection. We begin with the nature of what the church is. And we think about a MASH unit, for those of you who know about the sitcom from back in the 1970s.
Actually, the Robert Altman film, which was prior to that. And
like
then
late 1960s or something, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, which was like this stunning, like, kind of like pulling the curtain back on things that were like not easy to look at. I mean, not just to embrace, but like it was really challenging. But the MASH unit, a mobile army surgical hospital, that's what those words stand. That's in many respects that the church is a hospital. We are a mobile healing presence in a theater of war. This is what we do. St. Paul uses the language that we do not fight against. We are not in conflict. We are not at war with human beings. We are at war with principalities and powers, but he does not flinch in talking about the notion that we are moving against the gates of hell in this real conflict, albeit not one with which we have with other people. We are really in conflict with evil. And so I want us to be clear about our topic at a time in which what I would say there is, we've all maybe now become, or many of us have become familiar with the notion of deconstruction, where people are, for a lot of different reasons, finding reasons to walk away from the church, kind of deconstructing their experience of faith or the lives they grew up in the church experiencing. And I want to acknowledge that at the same time that there is a great deal to be reflective on about the church for corrective purposes. It also becomes very easy for us to just simply throw the baby out with the bathwater without recognizing that the church is God's vehicle for his mission. And there's no getting away from it. Like, we are the mission. And in that way, the hospital is God's way of being here on the earth. And how are we going to live in that space when so much has been difficult? So if we use that metaphor of hospital-acquired infection, what is that? We like to say in the medical field that it is what we call a nosocomial infection. Nosocomial, that's a kind of like a highfalutin word that comes from two Greek words, gnosis, or the word that means one who is ill, who is diseased, and comial, and that's one who tends the sick. So we're talking about an infection that is acquired by someone while in the presence of and context of those whose job it is to take care of them. Happens in hospitals. And it's also important to know that these are infections that are not present, a person typically, there's no evidence of them coming into the hospital with it. It might be incubating, but for many people, it is not something that they come in with, although it might be incubating and you don't really know about it. But many of these infections are ones that are literally acquired from their experience in the hospital. And it usually comes in at about 48 hours after you're admitted to the hospital. And it's associated with all kinds of things. Interestingly enough, we get infections from catheters, from central lines, from surgical sites, from ventilators. We get all these instruments that are instruments of healing. And everybody's doing the best they can, and still people come up with these, they still acquire these infections. And what's significant about it is that they tend to be some of the most difficult to treat infections once they're acquired. They often are what we call multi-drug resistant infections. You get the infection and then we throw all kinds of antibiotics at it and we can't get it stopped. This then becomes a problem because people have to be kind of quarantined and so that it doesn't spread throughout the hospital, because once it shows up in a locus of a patient, it now kind of collects a critical mass and now can be spread to other people through healthcare workers, all kinds of ways in which this particular thing is really difficult. I'm sure as our listeners are hearing this, you're already imagining where we're going with this. But it doesn't just spread within the hospital. Once that patient leaves, sometimes patients have to be discharged from the hospital and they take the infection with them into the community. And this then becomes a thing like the community now knows, oh, this patient or that patient acquired this particular experience, this particular infection in that hospital. Like, is the hospital a safe place for me to go? Like, if I go and have surgery there, will this happen? So in a similar way, we get a sense of like, well, how this works with the church, which we'll come to more explicitly in just a moment. There are some other things, though, that are risk factors for why these infections show up. Number one, that the infection control practices of the hospital, like how well is the hospital itself making sure that they're controlling for infections like this? The other thing that's that is a variable is like how vulnerable is the patient herself or himself to this? What's their immune system like? Some patients may pick up one of these and other patients don't pick up one of these. And then it also depends upon the various pathogens themselves that might actually be in the hospital, right? So you've got the hospital, they're doing their work to try to, do due diligence. You've got the patients that come in with a certain vulnerability, an immune system that might be at risk. And then you've got these pathogens, these bugs that are actually somewhere in the hospital. You can't know where they all are. But you have to consider a hospital is a place where people who come are sick. Like people don't go to the opera because we're sick. I don't go to my job because I'm sick. I don't go to the hospital to be entertained by the symphony. I go because I'm sick. And I go because I expect to be helped there. But I'm also I'm walking into a place where there are lots of other people who are sick and broken. And I sometimes forget that the people who are taking care of me are human beings. And those human beings also can be carrying illnesses that they may or may not even be aware of. But we all show up together, as it turns out, in this centralized place where we are expecting to be healed. And we don't expect to see hospital-acquired infections coming after us. There's another interesting thing about the trajectory of our attention and toward it and our posture toward it in the medical community. There was a time when we became aware of like, oh, that patient got really sick while they were in the hospital, or they went home after they were in the hospital and they got sick even after they left. We're like, where'd all this come from? And initially, of course, this wasn't a thing that the epidemiological folks would have been aware of. But over time, in the last 75, 80 years, we become more astute, more explicitly attuned to the fact that this happens. This is going to happen, and so we pay a lot of attention to it on purpose. We don't wait just simply to react to it. there are now entire medical missions whose job it is to pay attention to the possibility of outbreaks of nosocomial infections in hospitals. Like, that's their job. We're here to make sure that that kind of a thing doesn't happen. So we move from the implicit experience of it to being explicit with it. And here we're going to just start to make a bit of a turn, moving away from the medical metaphor to who we are as followers of Jesus, and just acknowledge that when we read about the temptations of Jesus in the wilderness, in the early chapters of Mark, Luke, Matthew, we recognize that the writers of those synoptic gospels were giving a pride of place, if you will, to this experience that Jesus had. They give you the story of his birth and his coming into the world, and then they let you know right from the beginning, our king, our chief operating officer of our chief of staff of our medical community, our great physician, has himself endured a story in which we are now telling folks, reminding folks, you need to know this is a hospital, and it's in hospitals where good things and beautiful things are being done that evil is going to come and double down on its work. And those texts of Jesus and his encounter with the Satan remind us that we should not be surprised that evil is going to do its most effortful work in the very place, in the very front line where his kingdom is being threatened. And this is what Jesus is doing, and this is what the gospel writers are letting us know. The trauma is what the serpent inflicted upon the first couple in Genesis 3. And it was his every intention to do the same with Jesus. And if he couldn't get him in the wilderness, then he's going to get him on Good Friday. And everywhere in between. We mentioned Genesis 3 and evil's intent to do its work, to use trauma in the very place, in the hospital. And we are reminded that in Genesis 1 and 2, that these kinds of things happen because we were made, as human beings, we were made to have dominion over the earth. We were made for power and authority. Diane Langberg does a beautiful job in her book of talking about how abuse in the church, trauma in the church, is a function of the good and beautiful gift of authority, the good and beautiful gift of power that has been bent. We think that when we're talking about abuse and trauma in the church, that it's like we're only talking about a bad thing, but we have to recognize that, like all evil, evil in its parasitic nature, it doesn't exist on its own. It targets authority, it targets power, and wants us to misuse it for our own purposes. We were given authority to rule and to create. Humans were given the authority to create and to rule together over creation, over that part of creation that is not made in God's image. And the way this is arranged is that, like, one of the ways that we, as we've talked in other episodes, one of the ways that our rule and our creativity is bound up being like God is in our very vulnerability. We are asked to create with vulnerability. And it is that vulnerability that is a doorway to creation and beauty that is the very thing that evil takes advantage of in its wielding of abuse of power and using that to traumatize those who are in the hospital. We get to Genesis 3, and we see deception, we see lies, we see, as we've said before, we see desire being disintegrated into devouring. And we come to see how power and authority is misused. We see it in the first couple. We hear about it in the curses, that he will be your master. He will lord it over you, men and women, and your desire will be for him. This is not a loving sexual desire. This is a desire. This is a devouring. This is an undermining. And men and women, of all the conflicts that we've experienced as human beings in the course of human history, none is more ancient than the war, than the abuse of power between men and women. But we then move from men and women to families. We see Cain and Abel, the first murder. We move to the abuse within tribes. Jacob's sons themselves, these 12 sons of Israel, they get into the promised land after a deliverance from the wilderness. Joshua ushers them into the promised land, and they spend 400 years in conflict, not just with the surrounding pagan peoples. They're in conflict with each other. They're killing each other. We move from tribes to the abuse of nations and races. We think of Isaac and Ishmael. We think of Jacob and Esau. We think of African Americans and Anglo Americans in our country. We think of Irish Catholics and Irish Protestants. We think of Jews and Gentiles. We think of all the things, all the ways that we then misuse and abuse power.
It was just saying power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Right.
Right.
Yeah.
And the thing is, there is always a power gradient in play anytime anybody is in close relationship with each other. There's always a power gradient. And, some people will think, it's like, well, if you think about a newborn, you think like, well, there's nobody that's more vulnerable in the world than a newborn. Except if you're the parents of that newborn at 2 a.m, when that newborn starts to squeal, you'd be surprised at how much power that newborn wields.
Yeah.
I mean, to tell you, you think like, well, it's just like, it doesn't even have the maturity of a dog. There it is in the crib. And like, I am out of bed. We all have different spaces that we occupy in different relationships along this power gradient. There are always people to whom I'm answering in authority and people who are answering to me, even when we're not aware of it. And this is especially true. This is an important piece because when it comes to abuse, those of us who are in the position of power and are misusing it are often quite unaware of the power that we have. We are not aware of what it is that we're doing. And this is not an excuse, but we're not aware of what it is that we're misusing this because we ourselves are wounded. And so we find that the wounding takes place by the wounded. And so we have people that come to the hospital that are in the church only to be wounded by those who are in some form of power. But this is not, Pep, this is not just a modern day thing. We would say that whole trajectory that we talked about from, that nosocomial infection, that whole trajectory from, the infections that take place in the hospital that are the most serious ones that we often encounter, and the things that we have that are making us vulnerable for it, and the impact that it has, and the risks and the contributing factors of all that. There is a certain recapitulation that takes place within the church, as it were. We have those of us who come with spiritual need, and we live in a power gradient with those with whom we are in relationship who are teachers and pastors and so forth and so on. But we don't necessarily pay that much attention, nor are we aware that that's actually taking place. But as I said, Constantine, Charlemagne, for those of you who recognize those names, these are ancient names in which Christian faith was, welded together with power and all the rest. And when that happens, when power is put together with our Christian faith, we are always going to be at risk. And so in some respects, there is a certain irony to what we're talking about today. Because in some respects, we would say, like, well, why wouldn't this happen? Why would we expect anything different? Not only that, there is an interesting thing that happens from the development of the mind standpoint. This notion that the mind is, as we like to say in interpersonal neurobiology, the mind and the brain is one big anticipation machine. From moment to moment to moment, I'm anticipating and expecting certain things to be the way they are. I expect to be able to pull my chair back when we're done and stand up and walk down the hallway. And I expect the floor to hold me. I don't think about that. I'm not thinking about it explicitly, but I'm living as if I expect the floor to hold me. My experience of trauma, in no small way, is often a function of my expectation of life. If I get T-boned in the middle of an intersection because somebody runs a red light, I not only have to deal with the trauma of what's happened to me physically, but I also then find myself having my own confidence in my capacity to trust my own judgment.
Right. So when, they say some of the biggest hurts come from those we love, right? And then you're hurt by someone that you love. And that's one of the exact things that happens. You start to look at yourself and say, I can't trust myself. I can't trust myself to know who I can trust and all that.
Exactly. So we have this effect that takes place within the community, right? There's an effect that then happens even in the community. And I can say, can I trust the church? I don't think I can trust it because look what happened. And I just want to acknowledge, again, I mean, we've talked on some other episodes here. We've given other stories like stuff happens in the church. Like you just can't make this stuff up. You can't make it up, and we're just kind of incredulous of the mistreatment that takes place in terms of power abuse, in terms of sexual abuse, emotional abuse, all in the name of God. And what we find is that just like in the hospital-acquired infections, when it starts to happen, it doesn't just affect the hospital. It also then eventually affects literally the community that the hospital serves. And we've heard countless stories of ways in which people have been mistreated in the church, and the witness that it then expresses to the outside world is really painful and difficult. The British theologian and missionary Leslie Newbigin, who has been as influential for me as anybody, was well known for saying that, and especially he wrote this commentary on the Gospel of John called "The Light Has Come," which I would commend to all of our readers, all of our listeners. And he makes the point in there that from the beginning of time, this isn't just about Christians, but from the beginning of time, even in our primitive states as humans, in no way do we assert our tendency to be God in an abusive, devouring way than we do in our religious lives. We are as much at risk, if not more so, of living out the curse of Genesis 3 in our religion than in any other domain of life. Which, of course, makes it all the more odd that Jesus would entrust his mission to us. You get the sense of even when in Genesis 1, well, let us make mankind in our image. And, we would assume that God sees church abuse coming. And they decide, we're going to do this anyway. Because we can't withhold ourselves from having humans share ourselves with us. We want them to be loved. We want them to have the experience of being loved. And we know this is risky because we also make them in our image, meaning that they're going to have the opportunity to decide what they're going to do. We're not going to twist their arms. We're not going to make them do what we want them to do. we're going to love them. And so we run this risk. And so if this is where we are, if this is the reality that we live in, that we live in a MASH unit that has hospital-acquired infections, what do we do? How do we respond to this? And this is where we turn to what I hope for us to experience as some helpful, hopefully some helpful recommendations. And this is where also I would, again, go back and emphasize that, digging into Diane Langberg and Chuck DeGroat's books will be really, really helpful, because we're not covering every jot and tittle, or we're not providing an algorithm here of what you need to do in your particular story, your particular situation. But there's some things I think that are helpful for us to be mindful of. And the first thing is we talk about being intentional and preemptive, just like in hospital-acquired infections, where we say that now we assume that these things are going to happen in the hospital. And so we have committees, we have particular things in place whose job it is to monitor this, to watch this, to be present to this. We're looking for where evil is going to want to try to show up. And so we like to talk about these three words that we've talked about in the consciousness domain of integration. These three words of being awake, alert, and attuned are AAA features. Awake and alert and attuned to what evil is going to want to do in our hospital. So we assume the ever-present potential for trauma in the church because we don't live in a neutral universe. We don't live fearfully. We don't live fearfully in the same way that Jesus did not live fearfully, but Jesus took it upon himself to, as we say, when he went into the wilderness, he didn't go there because the devil was looking for him. He went there looking for the devil. He was going to encounter the devil on his terms. He wasn't going to go in fully fed, fully hydrated. He was going to go in on his terms, and he's going to meet the devil in his. And so when the devil shows up, Jesus isn't surprised. And the other thing that is true about this is that our being alert, our being awake, alert, and attuned is a way for us to explicitly engage in formation. This process of things showing up in the hospital like this is part of the deal. God is not surprised by this. God is not pleased about this. And at the same time, God is not afraid of it. But God expects us to be alert to this so that it can be part of our formation when it does show up. In 1 Peter chapter 5, 6 through 11, the writer talks about, therefore, be alert and be vigilant. Your enemy is constantly prowling around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. And so be on the lookout for him. This is not to say, oh my gosh, like there's power and sexual abuse waiting to happen at every turn. It is for us to not be naive about the fact that, once again, going to church on a Sunday, being part of it, like, it is not a walk in the park. We are in the middle of a pitched war. And the New Testament makes no bones about this. The other thing then that is important for us to recognize and to be aware of is this power gradient along lines in our bodies of worship, in our bodies of gathering. There are people in leadership, pastors, priests, elders, deacons, teachers, administrators, and so forth. And that is on a gradient with followers, the laity. And each of us, each person, comes with our own story, fraught with its own capacity of unfinished business. We each do. The pastor does. The person who just walked in the door does. We all come into the hospital, right? Just like the physicians and nurses and so forth. Like, they've got their own infectious agents that are hanging around them that may or may or not even be aware of. Saint Ignatius, the founder of the Jesuits, developed what we call the daily examen. It is a way for us, and our listeners, if you don't know about this, I would like EXAMEN, the daily examen. I would highly recommend this as a way for our own personal use, a way for our corporate worship use, for us to become increasingly aware of and sensitive to, like awake, alert, and attuned to our own stories, and how our own stories can tend to draw us toward being in a position of being mistreated, but also being in a position of easily mistreating someone. So it's also important to recognize then that these hospital-acquired infections, these things that happen in churches, often don't happen like blatantly out in front of everybody quickly, and it's where everybody can see it and it's obvious. They're very silent. They're very subtle. This is how evil works. In the same way that HAIs are often showing up and we don't know that it's happening until like the patient is 48 or 72 hours into their infection. And so we have to be aware of the hidden nature of these things, and also recognizing that just like in hospitals, these abuses of power, these traumatic events that take place in the context of churches, they're not taking place because people are there with the explicit intention of trying to ruin people's lives. They often happen as a byproduct of attempts at healing. Pastors who are really gifted preachers, but who have their own story that does not allow them to lead without abusing their power. Administrators who are really effective at the accounting of the church, but who also sees everybody else as a number. All the different ways in which we experience this, even in the course of it being in a hospital, where all kinds of things that are taking place are instruments of healing, presumably, but can carry with them the darker side of things. And again, this whole notion of the give and take along the gradient, that we are all contributing to these things sometimes, and we're not often necessarily aware of this. And so it's important for all of us to be attuned to the parts of our stories, but in particular, leaders are given a particular responsibility at having their house in order. There's no question about this, that it will be required of you to give an account in ways that would not be required of those who are not leaders. It'll be required of us to give an account in that way.
So often I've seen leaders in the church make the huge mistake of isolating themselves, of, and so in that isolation, I've seen things sort of sneak up on them that they didn't realize was even there, because they weren't known by anybody. They weren't, and so then it comes out sideways. And I was in a couple of different churches. One big church split, the church was left gutted, and then another one that fell apart after I left, based on, a lot of it was the abuse of power, and people that didn't have that sense of thinking they had to have their own house in order, the way you speak of here.
Well, and I think too, I think of again this whole thing about, a couple things come into mind. You think of particular like medical institutions, like I think of Cook County General Hospital. I think of Mass General Hospital. These are hospitals that, in the kind of American medical consciousness, are like, they are in some respects like the Holy Grail. Like this is my pilgrimage. If I had to be in a hospital, if I had, well, sure, if Mass General is where you'd want to be, because there is so much knowledge, so much institutional. The Mayo Clinic, there's that truly has acquired over the course of at this point hundreds of years, like more than the kind of institutional care and knowledge that you would think this is really where I want to be. In many churches, like, we're drawn to churches, we want to be in these places because we believe that if I go to this church, like I've heard this pastor's preaching is off the chain. And indeed, it is.
Right.
And so I come with that, again, with that expectation, like I'm an anticipation machine, and I long to be seen, soothed, safe, secure. And there's enough on the surface of this experience that I've had that would lead my brain to anticipate that the floor is going to hold. And often the leaders themselves, as you rightly said, like and it doesn't, you don't have to be in a senior pastor, you can be in other roles as well. Often people who are in leadership, they themselves come to that place because they themselves are trying to get needs met, and they expect to get their needs met by being in positions of power in which, if they can wield that power, they feel better about themselves. And they're doing this because, as you rightly say, they're alone. And they've been alone for some time. This is a really common thing. And this is why we then talk about the proper people and place that are necessary for our ability to live in these institutions and even to seek healing in these institutions. So if we're a leader, who are the people by whom you're known? This is the Being Known podcast. This is we talk about this place of being known by others in the same way that the Holy Trinity represents a process of Father, Son, and Spirit are known by each other and know each other to the fullest extent. And then our being made in their image are made to be known in this way. And in particular, what is it like for us to be known, especially if we're in places of leadership? In hospitals, we have what we call the M&M board. This is not to be confused with a candy brand from Mars, for the Mars company. But the M&M board is the Morbidity and Mortality board. Wouldn't you love to, like, hey, what committee are you going to serve on? I'm going to be on the Morbidity and Mortality committee.
Yeah, chairman of the board.
I'm like, yeah, what are you going to be talking about? I'm going to be talking about disease, death, and pathology. And one of the things that an M&M board does, they meet every week in a hospital.
Mm-hmm.
And what they do is they review all the cases that went bad in the hospital. Now, of course, if you're the surgeon on the case that went bad, if you're the internist on the case in which a person was, developed sepsis like 3 days after they got into the hospital, like, it can feel like you yourself are just being put on trial. Because, like, oh yeah, we're here to figure out, like, well, what did Dr. Thompson do wrong? How were your surgery? And as it turns out, with enough practice, we recognize that every physician in the room has had the experience of being the victim of something going wrong. And they don't meet to rake physicians over the coals. They meet in order to better understand what happened. And there are times when we would say, yeah, I did not pay enough attention to what I did with what I did with the sponge. I did not pay enough attention to how I sewed that surgical. We did not. We gave him, we gave him 3 doses of this. We probably should have given, but the point is that the board exists in order to enable the hospital to perform better. They don't exist to punish people and cut them out. They exist in order to ask the question, what can we do better? We're not here to shame you, but we are here to name the things that have gone wrong in order for us to work really hard to not let that repeat itself. It's really important for us to have our version of the M&M board in places like in these kinds of organizations. And by that, we mean, like, who are the people that we are inviting into our worlds who are asking us the questions, not as inquisitions, but as people who are coming to enable us to be seen, soothed, safe, and secure, so that I can recognize where am I, perhaps making decisions, making choices, acting in ways that are actually me trying to work out my stuff, the part of my story that I don't know about, but I'm acting it out. I'm working it out in ways that are that's being harmful for others. And so we want to use these kinds of relationships at every level of experience in a church. Every level of experience in the church is going to need this. A pastor is going to need to have people surrounding her or him that ask the question, where are you? There's 4 questions from the soul desire. Where are you? What do you want? Are you willing to drink the cup? Like, what are the parts of your story that are in play? We want to help you tell your story more truly, so that you can tell the story of the gospel more truly, not just by how you preach, but also by how you live with the staff. In this way, we are, as a body, becoming alert and vigilant. Back to 1 Peter chapter 5. This is what he asks. He admonishes people to be alert, to be vigilant. And it also enables us to create boundaries in a merciful way. And by boundary, we could talk forever and a day about that topic of boundaries, about how pastors need to set boundaries, how parishioners need to be setting boundaries. The whole in boundaries that enable us actually to function in the same way that the boundary of a cell, of a human cell, the boundary of the cell wall, which is, it's porous. But it creates structure, creates protection. It enables that cell to function at its optimum. But it also does so because it keeps certain things inside and keeps certain things outside. The last thing that we'll say is that this general topic is that I invite us to come back to this notion that, again, it's easy for us to get kind of wrapped up in this notion of trauma in the church, and all we see is darkness. But I'm reminded of Jesus' high priestly prayer in John 17, in which he agonizes and prays for the unity of his followers. Unity not meaning necessarily even that they all think the same way or they all believe everything the same way, but unity in the sense that they treat each other in love. They treat each other in love. Henry Nouwen talks about the wounded healer in his book by the same title, and that there is power in the wounded healer. That for those of us who are in power, our being attuned to our wounds and allowing our wounds to really be kept in front of us at all times. In Mark 2:17, Jesus says, it's not those who are well who need the doctor. It's those who are sick. And there are those of us who come into the church because we are sick, and each of us, even the leaders in the church, have the parts of us that are still sick. When we talk about Jesus, we don't just talk about his work. We only ever talk about the work of Jesus in the context of the Holy Trinity. Jesus doesn't ever, he says, I only do that which I see my Father doing. And so we see that the place and the power of community in both being protective, but also healing. It's not just protecting leaders from the flock or the flock from leaders. It is also intended to create healing for everyone by bringing those parts of me that are still sick to the doctor on a regular basis. When we read about in Genesis this notion of being fruitful and multiply and subdue the earth, that subduing is intended again to be of the things that are not human. We are intended to subdue all that is chaotic and dark and that is not human. We are intended to create redemptive moments in the face of trauma. In fact, we are called to repair the ruptures of the most tragic kind. So for many of us here, I would want you to know that at the same time that the church feels like the last place where you would want to be or go, and I want to say, first of all, I get it. We get it. We've all been there. I've been part of a church that has, had ruptures that were relational in kind and sent people fleeing, and it's really unpleasant. And in some respects, it feels like and from some of it, like there hasn't been recovery.
Right.
And I want to say that it still doesn't change the fact that Jesus is coming for us, and that we in the body of Christ are the vehicle for this to take place. That the body of Christ is the healing hospital where we tell our stories more truly, where we name with confession and we act with repentance and forgiveness, where we are washing the feet of others. I realize in this episode, Pepper, we haven't, given people the 10-step algorithm for what you do in every situation.
Right.
But I do want us to be mindful of the fact that Jesus continues to come for the parts of us that are sick and that have been wounded by the church. Look, it was look, Jesus knows all about trauma in the church because he was living in it. He was living in places where the Pharisees were the ones who were, putting the widows and the orphans under the mat, as they would say, you strain out a gnat and the camel just walks through like, so he knows what religious abuse of power looked like. He knows what it's like to be in that place. And yet he says, I want you to pay attention to how I'm going to wield power. And for those of us who are wielding the power, he becomes the example. And for those of us who have been traumatized, he's also the source of that healing.
Just before we get to the application for this week, I just want to quickly just give a picture. When my daughter was in the hospital when she was born premature, which is a story we can tell another time, but she got an HAI.
Wow.
And they had to run a PICC line
Oh my gosh.
up, my rudimentary understanding was up through her vein and into her heart,
Right.
where they were pumping in and there's just something about this line that's going right to the heart with the antibiotics. There's a picture there that was the only way that she could be healed, and it was risky. They had to do it a couple of times. Like they pulled the PICC out and had to go back in, and in just the process of even putting in the line was a dangerous process for someone whose vascular system was so tiny. I mean, her legs were as big as my fingers, when she was born. So you can imagine, right? And yet, this was one of the best hospitals. You mentioned this was Cedars-Sinai Hospital. This was an amazing hospital with one of the best NICUs. I wouldn't have wanted to have been any place else with my daughter.
In LA. Yep.
In LA. Right.
Yep.
I wouldn't have wanted to have been anywhere else and have any other's care. And yet, even there, these things were happening.
Right.
Yeah.
That's such a powerful story. And because so many of us need PICC lines.
Exactly.
And the only place we're going to get it is at Cedars-Sinai.
Right.
Like, we're not going to get it from a street vendor. You're not going to get it at your house. You're going to get it in the very place where the infection showed up.
Yep.
And that's hard. And we just want to, it's hard. And Jesus is uncompromising in his longing for us to be not just in the church, but even allowing our lives as we are able. And here I just want to say, this is not some call for people to somehow be back in the church or be back in some place where you've been mistreated and it's not safe to be, and all those things. We're not advocating for that in any way, shape, or form. But we are saying that at the end of the day, it still will come back around to our having to come to terms with the fact that it is within the hospital setting that in God's MASH unit, that he's coming for us. So for our exercise, folks, we would, first of all, just want to invite you again to consider reading the 2 books that we've recommended. And next, and I know this can be tender, I would just invite you to reflect on if you've ever had an experience or experiences in which you felt taken advantage of by another, or realize that you've taken advantage of another in the context of what we would call like this church-related power gradient. If you've never done so, if you've never had that experience, consider speaking with someone you trust about your experience. Consider speaking with someone who you know has had that experience to give you a better sense of it. And if you have had that experience, but you've never talked to someone about it, consider doing that. And then we would invite you to consider the steps to take to begin the process of repairing the rupture that you've experienced in light of the guidelines that we've discussed here at the end of the episode. And we want you to remember that Jesus never gives up on the church, even if we do. And we might have like words for him at the end of the age about all this. And so even though it may take time, Jesus wants you to be where he is and is always in the business of bringing healing to the very hospital he has founded and is intended to be the house of healing itself. There we have it.
Thank you. Thanks, Kurt.
Pep, good to be with you.
Thank you so much. It's really good to be with you.
Yeah, right on.
All right. Until next week.
Till next time. All right.
Love you.
Love you.
So, Amy, you have a pretty recent foray into the hospital. So,
You did.
Yes, and I just want to, for those of us that have heard the beginning of this episode, I just want to pull my chart.
Wow.
And I'm gonna read my procedure.
Wait, all that paperwork for a toe?
Oh, okay.
I mean, it's a
who
a
picked
toe
up
for crying out
toe?
loud. I think it isn't. And isn't it like your little toe, like just a pinky toe?
Excision.
Why do they? I don't know why they don't just cut the toe off. I think that would just be.
It's
so
the
much
one that
simpler.
goes wee, 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 wee,
all the way home.
all the way home.
This little piggy.
This one.
Excision. That's a good word. That's a good, that holds some clout.
Excision?
Excision of
Excision.
soft tissue tumor on right foot, on the side of the right foot.
On the side of the right foot. Yeah,
There's no toe in there at all.
there's no toe. Wow.
There's no excision of tumor.
Why did you tell us it was
So-
just your toe?
Why
I
did you
never
tell us
mentioned
that?
toe. I never
Must have been
mentioned
under the
toe.
influence of the drugs when you told us that.
You must have.
And so I didn't realize that I was going to have to be on crutches until the very last minute. It said no weight bearing for 48 hours.
Wow.
So I'm like, okay, am I going to do a mad dash for crutches? So a friend of
Wait,
mine.
did they give you crutches in the hospital when you left?
No, they said BYOC, bring your own crutches.
Are you serious?
Yes.
Okay,
I
well,
don't know what's happening over here.
this was not Cedars-Sinai. Can we just say?
It was not. And thank goodness I didn't need a PICC line. But so I
Yeah.
borrowed crutches from a 12-year-old. And so they're ever so slightly too
Oh
short.
my gosh! I'm gonna say, like, that's kind of tough to be like. It's like you're bent over like you're 90 years old. Like just to have. Why do you? I mean, I would just want to hop. I mean, like, well, like if that's the crutches I got to use.
Well, and I'm on the upper level. There's someone below me. So I'm like, okay, I've dropped the crutches 12 times. And
Ugh.
when I do try to hop, so yeah, that's a whole thing. But getting ready
Yeah.
this morning, like I get up early, I go to the
Uh-huh.
bathroom, brush my teeth, and an hour later, I have about 10 minutes. Yeah, takes forever.
It does.
So I just want to be
I
clear, it's not my toe. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Kurt. I
okay.
want to hear.
No, I'm. It's like a lot of things. Like you injure your shoulder or your wrist, or you have this kind of thing happen, and suddenly you become aware of all the things that now take like an extra 2 hours to do,
Right.
just because they put me to sleep for 20 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And like I made coffee and then I'm like, how do I get my cup of coffee and my body over to that chair?
Oh my gosh!
But I did it. Yeah.
Well, we trust that the pathward port will come back as we want it to, and
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, and what I loved, Kurt, that you mentioned, I don't think we usually mention the name of the podcast on the recording, but when you said this is the Being Known podcast.
Yeah.
And like, even this doesn't have to do with trauma, but like scheduling my surgery. I yesterday was really my only option unless, or 3 weeks from now. But I thought, okay, we're recording. I would rather do it a different time. Like I would rather do my surgery, not the day before we're recording.
Right.
I had to, then I thought, I don't know if we're going to be, I didn't know what condition I'd be in this morning. And it was like, just all of that at one time would have given me tremendous anxiety. Like I've got to know if I can be on, I've got to have it together, not be in a sweatshirt. And I'm like,
Right. Obviously, you're not worried about that today.
I have settled in to my comfort level is very high.
Go, Pep. I know. I see it.
Oh,
I see
it's
it.
all
I see
good.
it. I see it.
That fruit's hanging so low, it's dragging on the ground. I'm just going to leave that
Go.
one there.
Uh-huh. Mhm.
I don't pick up rotten fruit off the ground. I mean, I will go for the low hanging.
You have your
I have my
your
standards.
standards. Yes, thank you. Mhm.
Oh my gosh.
So what any other takeaways, Aim, from the episode?
Yes, that wasn't my only
Aside your
takeaway.
toe.
My toe. Yeah.
Is that your toe?
Okay.
Yeah.
I wrote down the quote, but the hospital is the church is a hospital, healing in the presence of war. Oh my gosh.
Hmm.
And I thought, if it's anything less than that, it is not the church that God intended.
Right.
And I thought so I grew up in Northern California, Petaluma. Between the age of 6 and 8, my grandparents, who were hugely influential in my life, would take me to church every Sunday morning and usually Wednesday night. And it was a church up on a hill. There was this big driveway that led up to the church and it had a big field in front. And almost every Sunday morning, I remember Mr. Bond was the pastor, and he would always be out front greeting everybody. And I remember just opening the door and leaving Grandma and Grandpa and my sister behind. And I would just dash up the walkway to Mr. Bond. And he would pick me up. He would hug me. And it felt like he had waited. He'd been waiting there until Amy Chella got here. And I'm like, oh my gosh, that is my first memory of the healing of church, because things were a little bit wonky at home. And so this was like, oh my gosh, he is so excited I'm here. And, that's not everybody's experience. And I'm thinking, that is the church. It to a little 6-year-old, that doesn't even know she needs it.
Right. Well, I think about, I think about the notion that in the body of Jesus' first disciples, you've got the apparently appointed leader who betrays him utterly. And then you have, I love already, if you're following The Chosen, at some point, we're introduced to the other character who also betrays him. And the other character who betrays him, Judas, we are already being given this sense that this is a guy of deeply sincere faith and longing. This is a guy who really, really wants to do the right thing. And, betrayal, I'm just saying, like, betrayal happens in the heart of Jesus' own community. Like, you've got Jesus himself in a community that himself, over the course of 3 years, can't prevent betrayal from happening. And so, we who, it's easy to imagine, gosh, if it was only Jesus who were in charge, and we would say, like, well, Jesus was in charge, and even there, the behavior of those who were in the inner, one of whom was in the inner circle, throws him under the bus. And this is what happens when we are willing to put ourselves in the path of vulnerability, in this space where, where Mr. Bond meets us. And there is that certain risk that we take, which is all the more reason why vigilance is so necessary for us. And it's tricky. I take care of a lot of people these days for whom, like, this is the central traumatizing theme of their life. The life that they lived in the family of God, where really horrific things have happened. Not just when they were kids, but even now. Like, they're happening right now as adults.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and then that makes me think of the M&M board. And when you were talking about that, I thought, oh my gosh, it's not a shame board.
Right.
They're allowed to talk about and they're welcome and have freedom to talk about what went amiss, what they should have done differently, and what shouldn't have happened. And that's our only hope, right?
Well, and it's got to be in place from the beginning. It's got to be in place from the beginning, because you can't go in and do all this damage to people and then say, okay, well, let's put together this M&M board. And I mean, I think the M&M board the purpose of it is to stop it from happening.
Right.
To make it a healthier place.
Right. Not just look back.
Not just look back. Right.
Preventative, not repair only.
Right. But this is the other thing though, too. Like, the M&M board exists not just to anticipate and prevent things. The M&M board exists because they assume it's going to happen.
Yeah.
But it is, but the point is, and this is where, if we have something, if we have these kinds of relational matrices in place where people are known, it means that if you are practicing being on the lookout, if you're practicing vigilance, you're far more likely to catch things when they are in their infancy, where yes, people might get hurt. Yes, people might, something might happen to which we would say, oh my gosh, I did that. I'm going to we're going to repair that rupture right now. I had like a physical encounter with one of my parishioners. I'm a male pastor. I had a physical encounter with a female parishioner that, I probably that was probably too, word came back from an elder that when Kurt, when whoever hugged me, it didn't feel right. I'm like, okay, I gotta have people who will say okay, what's going on? What's happening? And to be able to say, yep,
And that requires all of us to be awake, alert, and attuned.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't, again, this is tricky because, we want to be careful and not, somehow communicate that the victims are responsible for their own trauma, right? This is one of the more common things that then happens I can't count the number of times in which I've taken care of people who something happens to them in the church. They try to bring it up. They try to address it. And, the leadership just doubles down and communicates the message that, well, if you'd only done this or you'd not done that,
my gosh,
then, this is not an uncommon experience for people to have. And so again, I think, anymore, if you were to build a new hospital, you wouldn't build it and start to practice and then wait and see if something's going to show up and then decide, I think we need an M&M board.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So to your point, Pepper, if you're going to build a hospital, one of the first things that you'll do organizationally is establish how are we going to lead the charge at being attuned and vigilant with all the things that are going to go wrong here. Because, it's like, if it's true that, evil does its best work in the middle of good work being done, then we would expect, that's what I was saying earlier, but why would we be surprised that some of the most painful things that we imagine happening to human beings happens in the very place where the best work is being done?
Yeah.
And so, but kind of like in our current cultural setting, we have to be careful about this, because in our current cultural setting, becomes easy. Being a victim is very attractive. I'm now at a point where if I am distressed because I didn't get an A on my grade in my college, my parents will who donate money to the college will write and say the professor needs to give my daughter an A because my daughter can't tolerate getting a B. Right? I can't, I'm a victim of that. I'm easily offended. I am fragile. And so that is a thing that is happening at the same time that these other real traumas are happening. And we have to be aware that, and again, I get back to Dan Allender's, I think really poignant and provocative comments in one of his chapters in the very first book that put him on the map, The Wounded Heart. This notion that we actually have to, even as victims, even as real, I have to repent from my practice of how I respond to having been traumatized, because a lot of what I will end up doing is I will tell myself lies. I will be in agreement with all these kinds of things, and I will also continue to make other people responsible for my ongoing emotional distress 20 years later.
Right.
And so it's tricky, because we have to find the line between, we have to name where the trauma has happened, and at the same time, I then have to recognize that I have work to do in the healing process, and that healing process itself is gonna require energy and effort. Like, it's not gonna be a walk in the park, and it becomes easy for me then to still hold responsible my predator, the person who hurt me, hold them responsible for everything that is now difficult about the work that I have to do. And it's really tricky. And so that whole
tricky.
process,
That is
Yeah.
tricky. I mean, it's
yeah,
I just have great empathy for somebody who has been abused in a way, in that fashion. And it's hard to, I know it's hard for people to separate, that incident that happened with all the other things. It's really hard, right?
Yeah.
Because,
Yeah.
you see this as the impetus of what's caused all your problems.
Right.
And,
And it is true. This is the other thing that is true that makes it all the more tricky. And that is that, in my experience, it is far more often the case that when a person experiences this kind of traumatic encounter within the church, unfortunately, is far more often the case that those parties who were responsible are not willing to take responsibility, are not willing to come back and repair the rupture. And so in some respects, it does make that in and of itself, though what the predator does, what the powermonger does, is not in and of itself now the story of the victim. The victim is going to have to decide, what am I going to do with my story? It is still the case that when the abuser does not acknowledge or repent, it does make the work of those who have been victimized that much heavier, that much more difficult. And this is the piece that I think that is most, weighty and hard for me when I'm working with people who are in a system, who are in a church that I'm probably familiar with because it's in my area, and we get people that are coming from all kinds of places, and the church leadership simply does not take responsibility for what has taken place. And it's maddening.
Yeah.
That would make all the difference, right?
It would make it would. And this is the thing, like the church leadership is often very unaware of the potential for, the potential for unbelievably beautiful things to come out of this if you would only be willing to actually do the work of repentance yourself.
Mm.
But, the very fact that these kinds of things happened in the first place is kind of part and parcel of the pattern of those folks who were in those positions of power.
Mm.
And, they didn't get there overnight.
Right.
And so, and so unless they themselves are also willing to do the hard work of asking the question, what happened to me, so that I can figure out what I've now done to others, it becomes really, really, really difficult.
Yeah. I think next season we take on joy. Laughter.
Well,
happiness.
right. Well, like we said, like we said, like it takes less than 3 seconds to experience and embed shame in our neural networks, and it takes about 60 to 90 seconds to do the same with joy. And so we figure like, well, it's going to take a lot of time, so we should take. I think you're right. Every single episode.
Every episode.
Yeah.
All right, guys. Thank you for today.
Good.
Feel
Thank
better,
you.
Amy.
Thank
Right
you.
on.
Take care of that
I'll
this
take
little
care of my
piggy goes to
toe.
market.
Take,
Yeah.
take,
This
take
little
care of that
piggy
toe.
goes to this little piggy.
Oh
goes
my gosh,
wee,
I'm
wee,
ending
wee,
recording.
wee,
We're done.
all the way
We're done.
home.
This podcast is produced by Kurt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well, be known.